I shouldn't have been sitting at that table. Not that night. Not with the house smelling like melted candle wax, and the wind still slamming against the window like it wanted to come inside too. Eleanor sat across from me, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold a while ago. She looked at me for 1 second, 2, 3. 3 seconds of silence that felt much longer than they actually were. And then she said something I never expected to hear from a woman I had known, until that afternoon, only as a polite wave over the fence. "Do you know why I never dated again, Daniel?" I didn't. And from the way she breathed before she went on, I understood I was about to hear something she had never said out loud to anyone. My name is Daniel Cole. I'm 42 years old, and until that fall, my life fit entirely inside a routine with very few variables. I worked from home ever since the divorce. I went for a run in the morning, came back, worked until late, and at night I watched something on television until I fell asleep on the couch. My ex-wife, Karen, had kept the house we picked out together, and I'd ended up in this smaller one, simpler, at the end of the street. 2 years had already passed since then, and I had gotten used to the silence, or at least I thought I had. My closest neighbor was Eleanor Vance, a woman in her early 60s, always put together even when she was just out watering the garden. She had lived alone since her husband, Robert, passed away 8 years before I moved in. I knew that much because the older neighbors mentioned it, the way people talk about someone who has simply become part of the scenery. Eleanor's house was the prettiest one on the street, not because it was big, but because it was cared for. The rose bushes out front, the gate repainted every year, the curtains opened every morning and closed every evening. Like a clock, nobody needed to wind anymore, but that kept on running anyway. I crossed paths with her maybe twice a week. A wave, a good morning, sometimes a comment about the weather. Nothing close to a real conversation. I had no idea that behind those open curtains was a house kept exactly the way Robert had left it, as if he could walk in for dinner on any given evening. I also had no idea that the storm that night would be the first time I'd ever step inside that house. The storm started around 7 that evening. It wasn't the first one that fall, but it was the worst. The wind tore a large branch off one of the trees on the street, and the power went out across most of the neighborhood. I was lighting a candle in the kitchen when I heard a noise outside. I looked through the window and saw a light flickering on Eleanor's porch, but from a strange angle, too low to be a lamp. I put on a jacket and walked over. As I got closer, I understood what had happened. A smaller branch had fallen onto the awning over her porch, knocking down a large pot, which had shattered on the ground, spreading dirt and pieces of ceramic right by the door. Eleanor was standing there, in the doorway, holding a flashlight, looking at the mess with an expression that wasn't quite panic. It was more like exhaustion, the look of someone who had already handled too many problems alone, and one more simply didn't change the total. "Are you okay?" I asked, already walking up. "I am," she said. "I just can't get the back door open to get this branch off the awning before it tears the whole thing." It took me about 20 minutes to get the branch off, secure the awning again, and gather up the bigger pieces of the pot. Nothing heroic, just the kind of thing any neighbor would do on a night like that. When I finished, she looked at me from the doorway, still holding the flashlight, and said, "I made soup this afternoon, before the power went out. It's going to go to waste if I don't eat it soon, and I never managed to finish the whole pot by myself." I laughed, more out of politeness than because I found it funny. "You don't have to, Eleanor, really." "I know I don't have to," she replied. "But I also don't want to eat cold soup alone, staring at that mess outside. Come in, Daniel, just for a little while." There was something in her voice that wasn't quite an invitation. It was more like someone opening a door that had been locked for too long. And now, just for that night, maybe because of the storm, maybe because of the exhaustion, decided to leave it open a crack. I stepped inside. Eleanor's house, on the inside, was exactly what I'd imagined from the outside. Tidy, but not cold. There were photos on almost every wall in the living room, and as I walked past them toward the kitchen, I noticed a pattern repeating. A younger Eleanor and a tall man with a wide smile in almost every picture. Robert. She served the soup in 2 bowls by candlelight, since the power still hadn't come back. We sat at her kitchen table, a small table, clearly made for 2 people, even though for 8 years only one had ever sat there. At first, we talked about simple things, the neighborhood, the storm. She asked about my work, and I told her, without going into much detail, that I did accounting for small businesses, and that I'd moved onto the street a little over 2 years ago. Alone? She asked, no hesitation, but with no judgment in it either. Yes, I said, divorced. She just nodded, the way someone nods when they've heard that sentence before, from many different mouths, and knows there's no need to fill the silence that follows. As the soup cooled and the candles burned lower, the conversation started to shift. She began talking about Robert, not like someone reciting a sad story for the 100th time, but like someone who had suddenly found a person willing to listen and realized how long it had been since that had happened. She told me Robert had taught history at a school in town for almost 30 years, that he sang off key on purpose while doing the dishes, just to make her laugh. That, in the months before he got sick, they had finally planned a trip to Italy, one they'd been putting off since their honeymoon, and never got to take. People think that after 8 years, you've moved on, she said, putting air quotes around the words with her fingers. Like grief is a phase, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But it's not really like that. It's more like learning to walk with extra weight. You get used to the weight, but it never leaves. I told her I understood, and maybe it was the first time since the divorce that I'd said that sentence and actually meant something by it. It was right then, with the candles nearly burned out and the wind still howling outside, that Eleanor set her spoon down in the bowl, looked at me calmly, and asked if I knew why she had never dated again. People assume it's because I never got over Robert, she said before I could answer. And that's not a lie. I never got over him, in the sense that he's still part of me. But that's not why I never let anything else happen. She went quiet for a moment, like she was deciding whether to keep going. She decided to keep going. The year before he got sick, things between us weren't easy. 30 years of marriage has phases like that. We argued over small things, went days barely seeing each other, even living in the same house. I caught myself thinking, more than once, that maybe we should separate. Not because I didn't love Robert, but because I didn't know who I was anymore, outside of being Robert's wife, and that filled me with an anger I couldn't even fully explain. I never said any of that to him, but I thought it, and 3 months later, he got the diagnosis. She ran her fingers along the rim of her cup, not looking at me. I stayed by his side until the end, of course, took care of him, slept on the hospital floor, did everything a wife is supposed to do, and we made peace in the end. But I never managed to tell him about those thoughts, about how, for a while, I'd almost given up on us. After he died, I made myself 2 promises. The first was that I would never take love for granted again. The second, she paused, took a breath. The second was that I didn't deserve another chance, because with the first one, I'd nearly thrown it all away out of exhaustion, and it felt unfair. Unfair to myself, in a way. Like I didn't have the right to try again after having thought about giving up on the person I loved most in this world. The house was completely silent, except for the wind. I didn't know what to say, but for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what I felt. "Can I tell you something?" I asked. She nodded. "My marriage didn't end because the love disappeared," I said. "It ended because during a very hard time, I just shut down." Karen and I lost a baby, 5 months along, 3 years before the divorce, and I never managed to talk about it. Not with her, not with anyone. I just went back to work, smiled when I needed to smile, and pretended everything was fine. And without realizing it, I drifted further and further away from her, until one day she told me it felt like she was living with a polite stranger. I had never said that out loud before, not even to myself, not really. "What I'm trying to say," I went on, "is that you're blaming yourself for being human, Eleanor. For getting tired, for a while, of a weight nobody can carry alone forever without ever stumbling." And I did the opposite. I carried mine alone until everything broke quietly. I don't know which is worse, but I know neither one means we don't deserve to try again. Eleanor didn't say anything for a while, but when I looked at her, I saw her eyes were wet, and she wasn't trying to hide it from me. "How long has it been since someone actually listened to you, Daniel?" she asked quietly. "A long time," I admitted. "I think since before the divorce." "Yeah," she said, with a small, sad smile. "Me too." The power came back around 10 that night. The kitchen lights snapped on suddenly, and for a second, the two of us just sat there, quiet, as if that plain white light had broken something fragile that only existed in the dark and the candlelight. But it didn't. I helped Eleanor wash the bowls, and when I was on my way out, already at the door, she said, "You know, I didn't expect to say any of that tonight. I think it's been 8 years since I said those things out loud, even to myself." "I didn't expect to hear it either," I said. "But thank you for trusting me with it." She smiled, a different smile than the ones I'd seen before. Not the polite neighbor smile, a lighter one, like someone who had set down a heavy bag, even if only for a moment. "Next time I make too much soup," she said, "can I call you? Without needing a storm as an excuse?" "You can," I replied. Honestly, I'd prefer it without the storm. I walked home that night thinking about how many people live next to each other for years, trading only waves, each one carrying stories they never tell, because nobody asks, and because it's easier to keep the door closed than to risk opening it for someone who might not know what to do with what's on the other side. Eleanor hadn't stopped loving Robert, and maybe she never would. But that night, she realized that holding on to that memory didn't mean she had to spend the rest of her life alone, as some kind of payment for a thought that had never even become an action. And I understood that maybe a second chance isn't always about finding someone new. Sometimes it's about finally letting someone see the weight you carry and discovering it doesn't make you any less worthy of being loved. It was just soup on a stormy night. But for two people who had spent years quietly protecting themselves, it was the kind of night that changes everything that comes after, even if, in that moment, neither of us knew exactly what would come next. This story is a work of fiction, created purely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is coincidental.